Hello and welcome, everybody. Welcome back to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian. Today I'm joined by a special guest, my kitten, as we try to take a light start to what feels like it might be a bit of a heavy topic here today. We're going to be talking about probably one of the most controversial weekends CEDH has had in a very long time. Now, I'm going to start with a couple question and answers that I think I'd like to get out of the way before the video starts. So, question one, why are we covering this topic? I don't like covering drama videos, right? I think that would be kind of a waste of everyone's time. I think it's a waste of the time of the people who are sitting at home watching these things, hoping to learn something by watching this content. And follow up to that, I think it's just unnecessary and it just creates a negative light. So, why make a video about these moments, these controversies that are happening in CEDH over the past weekend? One, because I want to remind everybody that while these controversial things are happening, there's also amazing tournaments that are happening. Two, I feel like I owe it to you as an audience. I have had many people comment in the past when I make commentary on things that are happening in our community that they're grateful because other creators in our space don't make commentary on things as much. Or if they do, it's often snide or negative, right? And I'm hoping that we can learn something from these things, which brings me to point three. I think basically everything that we had controversy around this weekend is actionable. I think there are things that can be learned from these negative situations. And I think there are things to be gained from these negative situations in the sense that we as a community or we as players can take actions so that they don't happen again. Now, what am I talking about and who to talk to? Oh, and I guess before we start, I think a really important disclaimer before we start this video. Um, I think that this is a constructive space. I try to keep this a positive and constructive space in this video, while also once again pushing for positive change for our community for CEDH tournaments as a whole. Now, if I see people in the comments down below attacking other people or in comments that I perceive to be excessively negative without any helpful criticism in them, I will most likely remove those comments just because they're not productive. And yeah, I want this to be a safe learning and growing space for people. Now, if people have very real criticism that comes from a place of a constructive energy to them, sure, I'll leave them in. I don't care about that. It's more people who are just being explicitly negative or harsh or insulting, all that kind of stuff. It's not going to make it in the comments. Throwing that out now before people start being like, Ian's deleting comments. Yeah, I will be. I happily will be. All right, moving on. Let's talk about our three controversy weekend. With starting, I think we have to start with one of the more medium-sized ones, and then we'll sort of scale up, right? And obviously, everyone's interpretation of scaling up for these things may shift accordingly, right? So there were three tournaments based over two different locations, right? LandGo was holding both an invitational and a 10K open tournament, right? So the invitational meant you had to win an event within the area, and then you would get invited to this bigger tournament, and then you'd compete for a Black Lotus. And then I think they eventually changed it so it wasn't just the winner take all, but the top four also got something. But I don't know that 100%. This is just what I've heard. To be clear, I was at one of these tournaments this weekend. I was not at the others. I was at the Salt City Convention, which we will also be talking about there. So Salt City Convention was a convention out in Utah. And then the Land Go events also had, aside from the Invitational, as I mentioned, an open tournament. So an open 10K, which is a classic CDH 10K setup, right? So two tournament setups. Let's talk about starting with the 10K for the CEDH event. Now, this is one that I think I have the least amount of context to, and I'll be very straightforward with that, right? So for this scenario here, as I mentioned, I have the least amount of context, but I wanted to highlight our player up here, who is our Lumra player. I won't be throwing specific names out in certain situations because I might not be aware of certain context, right? But the individual in question was playing Lumra during the course of their turn. They're attempting to combo to win the game, right? According to several players in the pod, they got to a state in which they had the win on board, but they failed to find it, right? Which is a rather normal situation in CEDH, right? Especially with more complicated Storm-esque decks or a deck like Lumra, where basically every single permanent, including your lands in the deck, has an alternative win potential to them, right? So there's a lot of complicated nuance that can go into a deck like this, right? And this is in the top 16 match that Lumro's having. So another player in question, who once again, this being a match that I am not reporting on through personal experience, I'm not uh, at I would feel uncomfortable throwing names out there in this situation because I don't have the full context. But basically, the story that I've been told is, and by several different sources, is that a player in the pod was basically weaponizing uh, politics over this Lumra player's turn, right? So, in a situation in which, as they are going through their combo, they are repeatedly talking over this player's combo, right? As they're going through it and they're executing their loops and things, they're speaking over the player who's attempting to navigate what is a rather complicated combo at the end of the day, right? They're non deterministically at this point trying to win with Lumra plus food chain, right? And this situation gets more complicated as time goes on. They've probably cast their commander X amount of times at this point, and they're being spoken over basically the entire time, right? Many of the viewers of this, including the players who were playing in the pod, have made comment that basically this seemed like an angle shoot by the player in question who is speaking over the person comboing, right? Attempting to basically, you know, while there are certain politics that are, yeah, you can speak of interaction points, you can talk about things like that. This seemed like an excessive move, basically trying to berate the player and fluster the player to the point in which they were no longer able to take game actions without basically having to say, like, please stop talking, right? Now, why bring up this one in particular? So, first of all, this is a tournament that I had very little context on, and this story got all the way back to me, right? So, for me, this is already a highlight, and it's been sort of all over social media. This particular instance, without as much context as I would like to be able to really dive into the meat and bones of it. But this is the general impression that I've gotten from all the stories I'm hearing about this interaction in particular. So, why are we talking about it, right? The first thing is that when you're using the MTRAIPGA, right, the rules that a majority of competitive EDH tournaments have, right, the rules have protections in place that you as a player can use, right? If someone is attempting to aggressively politic, they can actually get unsportsmanlike minor and then escalated to unsportsmanlike major penalties during the course of the game, right? So one of the things that I think is going to be very clear about the stuff that's happening today is that we're talking about using your resources as a player to be able to save yourself from people who are maybe pushing the boundaries of what the format could and should be in a social situation, right? People who are maybe looking to excessively use the boundaries of the format and push other people out of it, right? That's the part that I'm most concerned with here in today's episode, right? So this player basically was talked over for a majority of this interaction, right? And once again, this situation is one in which you as a player with priority have rules in place in which you can ask a player to not make comment on the play. And specifically, as an active player, for example, you're not allowed to be like, all right, no one's allowed to talk during my turn because your opponents are allowed to consider whether they're interacting, all of that kind of stuff, right? But if a player is constantly talking at you, especially as you are trying to make your plays and execute a win line, that is definitely an excessive use of politicking, right? And once again, if you call a judge on that and be like, "Hi, judge, I have asked this player to stop making comment, and they're continuing to do so," that, if able to be proven, if especially if the other players in the pod can corroborate that story, is an unsportsmanlike minor, right? Which means that the player in question would get a turn skip, and then if escalated, could be even farther away, right? And we're talking about a top 16 pod here, right? So a penalty like that is insanely impactful, right? And then not to mention what happens if it continues to escalate and pushes this player to the brink where they're like not sure if they're able to even think straight because they're being basically harassed while they're going through their combo, right? First of all, I cannot stress enough how this is so outside of CEDH, right? Like this is so not what this community is about. I think it's about a good social game, right? And harassing a player to the point where they can't think is excessive in many aspects, right? So that's the big thing I wanted to highlight with this particular instance, right? We want to be able to use our political prowess in games to potentially affect the fate of the game, to be able to make decisions. And it's even understandable and forgivable that some players may become passionate at some points. But if you are escalating that passion to a point where you are berating other people, where you're insulting people, calling people names, things like that, that is definitely far excessive and also something that is blatantly, covered in the rules of this game, right? Especially if you're throwing insults at another human being, right? That is not okay. That is an unsportsmanlike conduct, and it will get people penalties, right? So if someone is doing that to people in your pod or to you in the pod, right? Call a judge. They're there to basically protect you from harsh, aggressive, unnecessary social environments like that, right? As I mentioned, most of this episode is really just a PSA about the rights that you have as a player to not engage in environments that are super unhealthy for you. And my hope is by talking about these things that players can enjoy our format without, especially in the public eye, having these sort of negative potentials exacerbated without players realizing that they don't have to suffer through these awful situations, right? If someone's harassing you, if someone's throwing insults your way, if someone is politicking to the point where they are raising their voice, they're yelling at you, or they won't let you take a second to think, that is excessive. Now, it's a little bit different if someone's slow playing and you ask them to make a game action. That's a very different scenario. And I hope, obviously, not what I'm talking about in this moment, right? But if a player is slow playing, you can ask them to take a game action. It's completely different than basically attempting to talk so often that a player is not able to make a move, right? You as a player have protections. Please use those. You don't ever, you shouldn't ever have to feel like you as a player just have to be drowned out by somebody because they decided they wanted to be the loudest or the rudest person at the table. It doesn't have to be that way. Cool. That's all I had to say with that one. And as I mentioned, were to have, if I had recordings or if I had more specifics in my access at the current moment, I think I would use those a little bit more. I also want to point out that I'm recording this video right before I'm about to jump on a vacation. And also, I didn't want to cover these tournaments without mentioning this because I feel like that would be doing a disservice to the players who underwent some tough stuff, basically, or people might feel like it's not being talked about when it's an important topic, right? So once again, a lot of stuff we're talking about today. I know I'm sort of being cautious with the way I'm speaking about these things, but I think it's important to handle these conversations with a delicate hand. And once again, specifically, use these conversations not as a clickbait, Bravo TV, reality TV style thing where we're just drama farming here, but instead take these things that honestly are pretty negative and instead turn them into learning moments so that people don't have to go through this stuff again. Also, gotta shout out that the winner of this tournament was Kellen, who absolutely did amazing on Dargo Timna, a deck that I think a lot of people don't really take seriously in the current metagame. Now, Kellen has been playing this deck for a really long time, but really has been absolutely crushing it and came out and absolutely, I mean, 6-2-1 over a basically 9 rounds of playing is an insanely good record for this Dargo Timna list. As I mentioned, last couple episodes, proactive decks are looking pretty solid right about now, and Dargo Timna absolutely cooking. So congrats, Kellen, because as I mentioned, this is a deck that people do not take as seriously, and seeing it take down this really huge 10K is pretty sweet. And as I mentioned, some of these other tournaments I'll be breaking down a little bit more efficiently as time goes on. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the Black Lotus Invitational, the one I had mentioned at the start of this video. This one's a little bit more of a nuanced conversation because it comes to talking about cheating in cEDH, cheating in Magic in general, I guess, is the topic of conversation, and why people who have a history of it are allowed to come back into the game, right? So, we're going to talk about it. And this is one of those conversations that unfortunately I can't really avoid using the player who we're referring to. So, we're just going to talk about it. So, we have Temujin here, who, for those who are not, super deep on the Twitter verse, and also, as I mentioned, I could go out of my way to be like, hey, this person has been known for cheating in the past, right? But like, it's literally someone went out of their way to label them as a cheater on EDH top 16, right? So, at a certain point, the part of the conversation is unavoidable, right? So, why are we having this conversation? So, Temujin, at a tournament a few months ago. I actually don't know how long ago in general, but they were caught in a streamed tournament match. I believe it was a finals match. They had a Mystic Remora in play, and every time they were given a Mystic Remora trigger, they were squeezing the cards on the top of their deck, and they were actually drawing 3 cards at a time during this interaction, drawing excessive amounts of cards, which obviously gives them an insane competitive advantage if Mystic Remora is drawing you 3 cards at a time. The incident known as Mystic Recall, as some people have called it, which is probably the only part of this I'm going to laugh about, uh, is yeah, it got kind of blown up all over Twitter. There were videos zooming in on just it happening, and Temujin has gone out of his way to confirm this, admit it, all that stuff. And I believe he released a statement at some point, but I don't have access to that at this moment. Now, he has come back and participated in a few tournaments since then and has not been caught in any sort of cheating allegations. But obviously, winning a tournament for a Black Lotus is something that is going to put a player like this in the public light once again, right? So if he shows up and he does kind of middling at a few tournaments, no one's going to be like, oh, why is the cheater playing this tournament? However, if they win a tournament for a card that's worth 5 digits of value, right, if not more, obviously it's going to be something that draws a lot of attention. So, why are we talking about this here today, right? Because there's been some community feedback on whether we should be allowing folks who have been caught in the middle of cheating to participate in these events, right? And I think there's an argument for both sides, right? I think that this is a very nuanced conversation. But the summary of the conversation so far, and where I think I guess I'll throw in my own personal 2 cents at the end of the conversation. But we did have commentary on social media from the head organizer of the event, and I'll sort of throw that up on the screen here, right? So Wayne said, "This game and these events are my blood. I believe that with blood, as others do. That if I were to judge an individual on a single or few instances of the total of their life, I'd be greatly undervaluing a person. LandGo cannot and will not tolerate cheating in any form or fashion. A known cheater who is cognizant of their label and owns it can play in our events. That's simply because they haven't cheated in our events. Myself and our judge staff, who are some of the most seasoned and skilled in cEDH specifically, will take every measure to ensure the integrity of those events." And we have a cat interruption. um, so there's a lot of nuanced conversation to that. And a lot of the community feedback against that notion has been basically, well, you're not necessarily putting the onus on your judges. What you're really putting the onus on is the players in the tournament, right? Most situations, and I did read this in a couple places, and I do agree with this statement. A lot of cheaters aren't actually caught until afterwards, right? They're on a stream match. Maybe they did, for example, Temujin's original cheating incident was only caught because of camera after the event had been over, right? Someone was able to zoom in, see that he was drawing excessive cards, and move on from there, right? So it's putting a lot on players during Swiss rounds to basically go, hey, I think this player is cheating, to be able to see it, call it out in the moment, and go on from there. I know personally, I've played against multiple cheaters in the past, right? There's a very infamous video on this channel where I was like, oh, wow, this player had a crazy start, 2 rounds in a row. And then at the tournament's conclusion, like a week later, revealed that both of the players I had played round 1 and 2 were both cheating super badly. And I was just getting the low rolls on playing against the 2 cheaters in the tournament, right? So knowing that, right, going into these events like that, it sucks, right? Like it sucks to play against people who've been, caught against it. But more importantly, right, it's also really hard to catch, in my opinion, right? Like I'm, not going to be sitting there hyper analyzing everything my opponents are doing at every second of the game, because at the same time, I got to think about the actual game. I got to think about trying to win. I got to think about the social aspects of the game, not to mention, oh, well, I got to watch this person's hand and make sure that they aren't flicking a third card into their hand every time they draw to you, right? Like that's just, it's a lot on these players, right? So the sort of backlash in this conversation has been, well, yes, your judge staff probably could be really amazing and they probably can be insanely experienced. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because the onus isn't on them in most of these situations. And especially if someone isn't familiar with someone who is a cheater, right? Or has a history of cheating, then how are they supposed to know and be aware and be looking out for those things happening over and over again? And also, is the judge staff really supposed to be hyper fixating on one person in a, I believe, 132-person tournament? Is that something they have the resources to be devoted to over and over and over again? Seems like the argument, while I do agree that people deserve redemption, I do agree those things exist, right? And I do believe that people deserve second chances. I think it happens all the time, right? But the problem is it's it's the burden you're putting on the other people, the opponents that they're playing against. Not to mention if anyone is personally uncomfortable playing against people like that because maybe they did them wrong in the past, for example. So there's a lot of nuance that goes into it. Once again, I'm not sitting here trying to put one person specifically on the spike here and flame them, but it's more so to once again bring up a very nuanced and tough conversation about whether these people should really have any recompense in other tournaments. I mean, for online tournaments, it was very established that all the online tournaments talked to one another. And when someone was caught cheating, they were at least given a year ban from all tournaments, right? And so now are we telling people who can cheat that yes, they cheat, but if you just jump from tournament to tournament to tournament series, well, you didn't cheat at mine, so that's fine, right? It's a very tough conversation, and I think it's nuanced, and I'm definitely open to feedback on my perspective of it. But I'm also sitting here thinking, and once again, Temujin was not caught cheating at this tournament. There's been no commentary on him cheating at this tournament. This is more about people who are feeling uncomfortable with the fact that someone who has been caught cheating just won a card that's worth something like $30,000, right? So it feels very strange and it's very public in the eye right now, and also once again happens to happen on this weekend that is extremely controversial. So I had to talk about it in this moment because yeah, people are pretty upset about it, which I can understand, right? And obviously the response from the TO in question is also one that people have a lot of really strong feelings about, which once again I completely understand, right? I'm going to throw this out here. Here's my 2 cents. I think anyone who cheats in CEDH should really not be playing these tournaments, or at least take a reasonable amount of time to show that they have changed and that they're willing to work on themselves. I also think cheating is stealing. It is thievery, right? There are people who you are literally robbing opportunities to earn money. It is thievery. You are taking money that you do not deserve. And that's messed up. And I don't think I really have to go much deeper than that. So, moving on from this one, because this is honestly emotionally exhausting to talk about. um, yeah, this is more for TOs to think about. And I think a lot of TOs should be coming together and having these conversations. And we should also be respectfully having these conversations with organizers about what it takes to hold people accountable for their actions in the past and whether we should be allowing these people the opportunity to take advantage of other people's ignorance again, right? Like the ignorance of their cheating, right? And it sucks. It does. It sucks because, this is an awful situation for literally everyone involved. Obviously, you want to give people second chances, but obviously, you also want to make sure that the players who are showing up, who are trying their hardest, and who are not being thieves, you want to make sure that they're the people who are protected as well, because what have they done wrong in this situation? Moving on, as I said, that one's exhausting. All right, thank you, Winota, giving me a little cat break here. And as another highlight, there's a lot of cool things to shout out, but with this invitational. But I definitely have to shout out Cole showing up and getting fifth place with Atali. Cole is someone who I've worked with for a really long time, and who I've known, good friend in the community. And so seeing him show up and perform with my favorite deck is super cool. So sad he didn't make the top four, but he absolutely crushed it. So hell yeah, dude, nice job. Now we're going to talk about the tournament that I was at. And I will be doing a top 16 breakdown of this tournament in addition to this video. But once again, I wanted to get this part of the conversation out of the way so that when I do the top 16 breakdown of this tournament, I can just talk about the tournament and the cool decks and the amazing time that I had at this tournament, as opposed to the tougher parts of the conversation that we're covering here today. So, as many people have probably heard at this point, Salt City CEDH Con is now infamous for having the longest finals match of any CEDH event ever. The finals match of this tournament went over 11 hours and only came to a conclusion because a player in this pod had to catch a flight home because it took 11 hours, starting at 5 p.m. on Sunday and going to almost 4 a.m. the next day, if not actually maybe a little later. So that's obviously an insanely long match of Magic the Gathering, and an insanely long tournament match. So there's a lot to talk about here. Before we even start with this conversation, there's, in my opinion, an equally important and equally controversial thing that happened for this top four here, right? And once again, I'm not going to go into which individuals I'm referring to because I don't think that's fair to anyone involved at all. But I will say that two of the top four players in this pod actually did not have records that would qualify them for the top 16. In those situations, players in their pod were basically engaged in a conversation in which they said, well, no one in this pod with a draw can afford to make the top 16. So maybe we should all just concede to one player so that at least they have a chance of making the top 16 of this tournament. Now, I know while this is a thing in 60 card formats, I think that this is a lot more impactful in cEDH. Because your win thresholds in cEDH are so different, I think it's a lot harsher in this format, right? The difference between someone who didn't even have more than 2 wins going into top 16 versus someone who, has been winning the entire tournament. And the tough part for me is I think every time this conversation comes around, right, there is somebody, right? So in the case of this tournament, right, 17th and 18th place are the people that I'm thinking of in this situation, right? Because to me, those are players who had the records to make top 16 and who won the games that would have gotten them to top 16 or had the right amount of draws, wins, etc. They got the records that they needed to be able to make the top cut of this tournament. But other folks decided to just let someone else take their place. And that's a several $100, if not several $1,000 decision. Think that's tough, right? I think every time that people broach those conversations, my instinct is to go, well, people who win games should be rewarded for winning games, right? The people who play strong, who are basically earning their place in the top cut, should be the people who are going and putting up those results, right? And so that makes this part of the conversation very awkward, right? My opinion in general in these situations is that if no one in your pod is going to make top 16, because they can't afford a draw, and that is a tough thing. But there is someone who earned their points, who will be able to make top 16, who should go ahead and do that. That, and I cannot tell you how many times in the past this has actually come up in cEDH tournaments before with people who insist, you can't afford a draw, you can't afford to win, etc., who have actually been wrong about the bubble in tournaments, especially when it comes to longer tournaments with many players, right? There have been players who have insisted that the records were not good enough in certain situations who actually have been wrong in those situations. And it's led to even more controversy in these situations, right? So, my point being, in general, if you are thinking about conceding to players so that they can make top cut in these situations, take a second to consider 17th and 18th place and think about maybe what the impact of the action has for those players. And that's where I'll leave that. Now, let's go back to the fact that we are in this finals match with, once again, two players who they won their semis. They won several games during Swiss, right? But we're also maybe shouldn't even have been in the top 16 in the first place when it came to people who sat down and won the games that they won, right? So now we're in this finals match, which I have not sat down and watched all 11 hours of this game. I was there that night. I left basically as soon as the semifinals concluded. Oh, actually, no. When I was leaving, when I was packing up my hotel room, I think the final had been going on for about 3 hours at that point, maybe even four, actually, because I think it started at 5 o'clock MST, and I left at 9 o'clock MST. Right, so I had a midnight flight out of Salt Lake. So when I left, the finals match had already been going on for 4 hours. After two flights and a little bit of a layover time in a different state, getting me all the way back to the East Coast, I get a text in the morning from one of the organizers basically saying like, "Hey, just ended. We're going to bed." So obviously this is a very crazy situation, right? Um, why are we talking about this here today, right? Because I think what should be rather obvious in this conversation is realistically a game of cEDH should never last 11 hours. And I don't think that's a controversial take. And if it is a controversial take, and you're someone who's saying that these games should go as long as possible and we just have to deal with it, really I want to take people's time to think about these things and readjust that thought pattern, I would argue. But why did it take 11 hours? Right. And once again, this is a lot of information that has been recited to me. And I did have conversations with the TOs in particular because I wanted to get not just the outside perspective looking in, but the inside perspective who is doing basically their best to make an insane situation not feel as insane, right? And I'm also going to throw out here that I went to this tournament and I had an amazing time at this tournament. And I do feel bad that this tournament's probably going to be overshadowed by this because in general, it was a great time and a lot of people had an awesome time playing this tournament. So, what were the problems here, right? The first is, in my opinion, and from what I'm hearing a lot from feedback, was a lack of calling of slow play, of pushing conversation, etc. Right? I think there is this notion sometimes that in a finals match, you kind of want to let people play the magic they're going to play, right? Which I think is a perfectly valid point, right? Um, and for some clarity here, for some transparency, I've already been in conversations with some other TOs at this point who, after seeing this last weekend, were having really very real conversations about what do you do when a finals match that's supposedly untimed goes this long. Now, I'm of the opinion that I think and the 20-minute timer at the extension of turn 0 was a controversial take at some point, but it was one that I pitched a really long time ago, right? And now we're implementing it. So, I'm hoping that after this weekend we can all learn from this and move on. But I think reasonably speaking, there should be a 3-hour time limit, and with any draw, the person who has the highest seed from Swiss is declared the winner if they can't find a winner in time. I think it's way better than the life total rule. I think it's way better than the permanence in play rule. I think it's better than the cards in library rule. I think all those rules are just basically dice rolls, as opposed to if you did better in Swiss, you should be rewarded so that if a match goes excessively long, you have this automatic win condition of I win the game because people try to drag it to a draw, right? That is, I think, at 3 hours, an excessive amount of magic, anyways, right? I think 3 hours, then cut to the leader of Swiss seems fine to me. I really don't have a problem with that, right? But how do we get to this problem in the first place, right? Because once again, if you think about 11 hours of magic, really very rarely in those situations do we get to the point where you go, yeah, everyone should be playing at the appropriate speed in that case, right? And it's okay for players in a high stakes round of Magic to be playing in a way that is methodical, that is well thought out, that is communicating effectively, right? I'm not saying stop talking. I'm not saying stop politicking. I'm not saying rush these players. But clearly, we got to a point that was way past reasonable with this situation, right? That's the thing that I think it needs to really be clear here. You should be able to politic in cEDH. cEDH without speaking to your opponents is a nothing format, right? But obviously, this is a final manifestation of things just going too far. And I think we're really clear about that in the situation here, right? And I think, we're seeing a pickup of like proactive decks in the format so that you don't end up in situations like this, right? Just full games that are just conversation and over analyzing and all of those things, right? I think there is a point where I would be surprised if no one in this pod should have been DQ'd for slow play. I think it is rather ridiculous that you look at an 11-hour pod and we can debate about how no one got slow play warnings in this pod. I was told that there were situations in which judges asked for an action from an opponent, and when they didn't get that action, they said, okay, you are passing priority in that moment. And that's a situation in which I think instead of you are passing priority, you have a slow play warning, you are going to get a turn skip. If you get another one of those, would have been a much more effective tool in those moments. And that is one criticism I'm definitely finding in this moment. Now, to be clear, I asked about what happened at the end of this tournament, right? And so I think there were a lot of opinions online. There's a whole Reddit article, I guess you call it a Reddit article, Reddit thread, right? About this event and people breaking it down. Once again, haven't watched all 11 hours. I am sourcing a lot of information, including, once again, from the TOs, the judges, the people that were there, right? So at the end of this 11 hours, one of our players has to catch a flight and they decide to basically do the breakdown that I mentioned, where everyone takes their Swiss records and the prizing of the event goes that player gets this player gets that, and then they just went down the line, and whatever was originally going to be for first, second, third, and fourth was distributed according to their Swiss records, which I think is a very reasonable place to distribute that at the end of the day, right? If you can't come to a conclusive winner at the end of the day, one, two, three, four, that's the record, move on, right? Now, being clear about that, I think that was a really good way to conclude it many hours before 11 hours. I think at the time, I don't know, 5 hours was going into the sake of this conversation. I believe it is appropriate for a TO to say, hi, we have reached a point of excess. Now, once again, part of the conversation here today is saying, look, Winota doesn't like this part of the conversation. I think part of the conversation here today is saying, let's put rules in place so that we account for these things so that you as a tournament organizer or you as a community member organizing an event don't have to make up a rule on the fly, right? This is a conversation that we can have where we can go, okay, great. Okay, there are rules in place in case in matches of Magic go to an excessive point. Because if people can use this opportunity to go, all right, we will make sure we don't lose. And then we'll overanalyze every play. And then we'll overanalyze any play. And then we'll overanalyze any play until the point where they attrition the entire table out of resources and energy. That doesn't seem as much of a win con as opposed to, hey, let's play a round of Magic. Let's try and get a real winner of this game. And there is a real clock that will determine the course of this game. Let's go from there. I think that's much more realistic, and I think it's much more appropriate in these situations. But this is a situation too. If you're a judge of cEDH and players are basically pushing your boundaries to the point where you're going, hey, you need to make it game action or pass priority, and they're going, that should not be a situation in which you are instead like passing priority for them, but instead they should be getting slow play warnings. They should be receiving an appropriate punishment for basically abusing the rules of the game to a point in which, once again, a match of Magic, one game of Magic takes 11 hours. This is obviously a ridiculous situation. And not only does it look bad on the tournament organizers, it's extremely expensive for these tournament organizers to have events going hours and hours past when they have reserved space, right? It's bad for their angle, it's bad for players, right? Players, and especially players on camera, are going to be worse. They're going to be worse at handling themselves. They're going to be worse at composure. They're going to be worse versions of themselves after 11 hours, right? So not only are you having aspects where players are playing worse Magic, but also where they're navigating really intense social situations for half a day, half a day, and now their ability to communicate with other people is probably exhausted, not to mention the fact that they've been playing Magic all day before this, right? And so we're at this point where these players are probably showing not great versions of themselves because they're probably emotionally, physically, mentally exhausted because they've been trapped in a room for multiple hours on end. Now, one thing I will throw out, I did see the players got many breaks during the course of this tournament because yeah, I hope they would. But obviously, this is excessive, right? It is excess in general, right? So there's a couple things to be learned out of this one. I know I've sort of rambled a lot about this one in particular, but this is obviously an insane scenario here, right? So, part one, we should have a time cap that follows the same rules as a draw in Top Cut. Basically, if things go to an excessive amount of time. Now, I've been talking about this with the TOs, but there was different times thrown out. I think that 3 hours is definitively, without a doubt, excessive time. I think that is a point in which nobody would argue that it's gone too long, right? I think anything before that starts to get into the conversation of people can angle shoot time in a way in which, yes, you can still call them on slow play, you can still call them on DQing, but it might be a little less obvious, especially in nuanced stack battles, et cetera, right? So I think the 3 hour mark is definitely a point where it's like, this is clearly too long. We just got to call it. We'll go by Swiss record, right? But that being said, the time is a little less specifically important. I just think it also needs to be important to mention that like anything less than that starts to get into kind of messy territory, right? So time limit on untimed rounds seems appropriate at a certain point, right? Two, if you're a judge, if you're a TO, and you're in a finals pod and people are pushing things to an extent, just because that not doing timed Magic anymore doesn't mean that they're not abusing the rules of the game. If someone is having, especially, and this is a word I've been using a lot for these things, circuitous conversations, conversations that are going in a loop, right? I remember being in a semifinals match at one point, which my opponent went, "Hey, do you have this piece of interaction?" No, I have a spell on the stack at this moment, and it's a very good spell. It's probably going to be at least pushing for a win towards this game. They go through a conversation. They decide, okay, let's do this, or do we need to take this extreme measure? No, we're not going to take this extreme measure. Goes back to the same player. All right, do you have this resource that you already asked about beforehand? And I said, hey, we've already asked about this. We need to start passing on these things, right? But if a judge or a player is not calling people out on that stuff, they can sit there and have circular conversations to draw out time, to draw out information, to basically abuse rules in the game to just extract as much data as possible, right? Instead of just playing magic. And I think, once again, this is really on judges and TOs to be calling these things. But as players, this is on you as well. And this is why, once again, we're having these conversations. If you're a cEDH player and you think your opponent are specifically talking to burn time, to basically micromanage the game to a control state, call that out. It is not okay for players to be manipulating so much time in the game, much like we talked about with the Lumina situation earlier, so that they are dominating the game by just having a physical hold over it and basically saying, I will control every second of this game. It does not matter. That is not okay. Slow play should be called in those situations, even in top cuts, because yes, there is real implications of the time in people's lives, right? Not everyone has days and days and days to just play Magic. People need to go to their real lives. Event spaces cost money. These things can get out of hand. And obviously, the situation got insanely out of hand. And I don't think it's controversial to say that. This is excessive in every sense of the term. And once again, no shade to the players individually, but this situation was out of hand, right? But it's also because they weren't confined. When you give people infinite time, they're going to take infinite time because guess what? There's a lot of money on the line. And that's where it gets really tough. That's where these situations get a little messy, right? The fact that after 11 hours, the game didn't even come to a conclusion, I don't think anyone is satisfied with that result. And you can see the public reaction to it has been abhorrently negative. I'm not surprised, right? Like, it's clearly ridiculous. It's clearly past the point of reasonable, and it's a problem. Once again, I don't want these moments in these tournaments to overshadow all of the good that came out of these tournaments. There was a lot of really good Magic that happened at the Salt City event. I've been told by dozens of players who were at LandGo that they had an amazing time and that they don't want these things overshadowed by these more nuanced situations. But it would also be irresponsible of me. Noda, you're so fresh. It would also be irresponsible of me to not talk about these things because I think that there are lessons to be learned here. And I think we as a community can gain things by talking about these moments in our format, these conversations that hopefully we don't ever have to happen again because guess what? We have people who are working on rules for our format that can go, yeah, that situation was kind of awful. Why don't we figure out some rules that fix that? This is great. And I think this is a great opportunity to basically have moments to eliminate negativity for the format, right? And especially, I want to go after that first example that we talked about today. If a player is creating an excessively negative environment, the rules do have things for you. There are things in the rules that say we care about our players, we care about their mental health, we care about their physical and emotional health. There are rules in place to say if someone pushes it too far, call them out on it, right? It is excessive and it's unnecessary. And I think you have every right to say, hey, here's the thing, let's move on from it, right? So, all that being said, no, this is kind of a heavier episode. I'd love to just talk about decks and shit. Sometimes it doesn't work out that way, but I'll be breaking down some of these tournaments. As I mentioned, I'm on another plane. I got back less than 24 hours ago, and I'll be on another plane within about 12 hours. So it's kind of a crazy week for me. I might not get to all the breakdowns I wanted to get to, but genuinely, I think this whole conversation, this whole video, can be really constructive for our community. And I'm hoping you think so as well. Now, everyone out there in the audience, thank you so much for watching this. I genuinely appreciate it so much. Please be kind to one another. It's so important for these conversations that if we want our community to grow and, if there's damage done by these types of things, to heal, right? Be kind to one another. Be kind to one another in the comments of this video. As I said, we're trying to talk about these things so that we can learn, so that we can have a better future. So let's use them as lessons. Let's use them constructively and let's take all of the nonsense that kind of happened this weekend and then use it to funnel into something productive, to something that we can use to make CEDH better, to make our community better, to make our tournaments better, and just have an overall better time as we are all sitting here playing this game together. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below, but as I said, please be kind, please be respectful, all those things. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.